Hello everyone. We're really happy to be able to join this conference and talk about the HOPE project. That means housing, export and prefabrication, the architecture of reconstruction in times of crisis. This interdisciplinary project researches the architecture made by Puutalo Oy, a Finnish company that exported hundreds of thousands of detached wooden prefabricated houses all over the world in the post-war decades. We especially look into the export to Poland and Israel between 1940 and 1970, and also into the question of these kind of buildings as a global cultural heritage in an industrial setting. The project is funded by the Finnish foundation KONE, and it's based at Åbo Akademi University in Turku, Finland. When it comes to definition of architectural cultural heritage, these kind of prefabricated industrial houses rarely enter this discourse due to their temporality and also not being classed as high architecture. But in our project, we would like to challenge this question and show that this worldwide impact that these houses had could be seen in a way also as a cultural heritage, but from a very different perspective. Industrial prefabrication of wooden houses had started in Finland already in the 1920s and 30s. There was also substantial export to both North Africa, Europe and the Levant at the time. But it was during the post-war decades when the industry started growing rapidly. This had to do with that Finland had two wars with the USSR between 1939 and 44. And after that, Finland was deemed to pay a substantial war reparation to the Soviet Union. And a part of that was the wooden houses. As well, we had also these 400,000 Karelian refugees who had to be housed somewhere in Finland. And they were all in need of quick housing solutions. So in this situation, the Puutalo company was founded. It was a sort of joint venture for 21 different sawmills all over Finland. And they began producing type plans for basically prefabricated housing. And these houses then were produced in large scales and not only used for the domestic market, but they were also shipped worldwide. In Finland, the type planned houses and also the prefabricated houses of the kind you can see here behind us became a very important part of the visual narrative of reconstruction in the years after the wars. And today, these kind of houses have become a very cherished part of the sort of architectural heritage here. There's a lot of interest among people who live in these houses, to upkeep them, to maintain them, and to try to properly sort of restore them if needed. And this kind of houses were a way also for spreading modernist architectural ideals all over Finland, because they were easily transported, easily constructed, and that was in a way many people here's first contact with some sort of modernistic architecture. So this is in a sense today in Finland an important part of the cultural heritage, especially when it comes to the reconstruction period after the war.
Two of the countries which imported Finnish houses, as they often were called locally, were Poland and Israel. Though arriving as a foreign commodity and temporary housing solutions, these houses marked the lives of many and became embedded in local memory, becoming a unique instance of industrial architecture and cultural heritage. A major recipient of Finnish houses was Poland. The large-scale destruction of the country's cities and industry during the Second World War, as well as its relations with the USSR, played a critical role in the extensive import of detached houses. Some of the earliest Finnish houses which arrived in Poland were a gift from the USSR, which had acquired the buildings as war reparations from Finland. These houses arrived in 1945, when several hundred wooden buildings were distributed to 3 locations. One of the first neighborhoods, Osiedle Jasdov, was built in the city center close to a former royal palace parks. The houses were designated for the workers of Warsaw Reconstruction Office, who were engaged in rebuilding the city.
So welcome in Jasdov in Warsaw. Here is one of the main remained settlement of so-called Finnish houses, which were brought here in 1945. They were gifts from USSR to Poland. and before they were given by Finland as a war reparations to Soviet Union. As we can see, we are in a very strict center of Warsaw. It is very loud. The neighbors are parliament and embassies and Museum of Modern Art and a lot of historical parks. But in a minute you will see that Jastorf settlement is a totally quiet piece of land in the middle of the center of Warsaw. So let's go to explore. Here is the sign showing that we are entering the open Jastorf neighborhood. So now we are in just the center of the neighborhood. The houses came in 1945 and they were built over a weekend. We can see one of the examples there. They were built over the weekend because there was such a need of places to live for people incoming to completely devastated with the war Warsaw. The houses were designated in Jastorf, in this neighborhood, for Warsaw Reconstruction Office workers. This was the organization that was supposed to rebuild Warsaw on a large scale. There is also one more settlement of Finnish houses, and there was also even one more, but that one doesn't exist anymore. The Jastorf settlement from 1945 was supposed to be temporary project. The houses weren't supposed to stay, but there is nothing more permanent than temporary solution. That's why we can see them still nowadays. However, it's not the only reason why. Since the houses were built in a very special way, creating spatially some sort of nests of different few buildings, kind of joining their gardens together, we think that that created a very specific neighborhood social relations in this area. These relations are strong till nowadays. So from around 2011 there was a lot of threat to destroy the neighborhood, and the people living here, who are still living here, they established an association to defend those houses. Already at that time, slowly they were starting to come here different non-governmental organizations, and many cultural things were happening around this heritage in here. I told about strong social relations, and here we have so-called dialogue square, so a square where all the inhabitants can and people who are renting the house can come and discuss. And there we have exhibition on history of how it was to live in those houses in here. From 2011 till 2014 there was a big battle to keep this neighborhood, to keep that history and heritage, despite of authorities' plans to build here, for example, history museum. In 2014, on the request of inhabitants, first public consultations happened in Jastorf, and after that more and more security came to this area. So around the heritage a lot of initiative grew, like this heritage would be a magnet to build new things above it or around it. There are gardens, many community gardens. Here's one of the biggest garden. There are different NGOs in different houses. There is an association of students of architecture. There is different workshops, music festivals. There is a pizza oven and more. There are exhibitions, different sort of installations, and so on and so on. They also got a prestigious mention in Europa Nostra Heritage Award, which only strengthens this idea of living heritage. So heritage which is reused and it's alive, the heritage which is inhabited. It's not just a frozen image, and that the biggest meaning of that area is. And I believe that this sort of Finnish architecture in the middle of really middle of Warsaw was kind of a magnet for people to use their creative powers to build the city together, to deliver what is lacking according to them in the city. So welcome to Warsaw. Thank you.
The story of the Finnish houses represent a change in the role of the imported prefabricated temporary housing solution in creating long-lasting presence and communities in the receiving countries. Brought through politics and trade in a very specific time of crisis, they managed to survive and even to create local identities and communities. In the Polish case, the houses, which were assembled as a quick remedy after the crisis, became homes to communities which cherished their sturdy character and the quality of life they provided. The fate of the houses in Poland was very different than those sent to Israel, where the houses arrived during the same years, but to completely different circumstances, creating an even more complex heritage and history.
In Israel, the houses were assembled in a very, very different territory. In the 1940s and 1950s, thousands of Finnish houses were imported to Israel as part of an agreement between the two countries. In Israel, which was just going out of the War of Independence in 1948, there was a great need of housing following the Great Immigration, the Aliyah Hamonit, which meant that an influx of refugees and immigrants were coming to the country after the Holocaust and after being driven away from their houses in their own countries. This meant that these people needed housing, they needed it fast, and they needed it to be cheap in order for the country to be able to pay for it. Because of the economic situation, many of the houses were traded for citruses. Israel was sending oranges and other citruses to Finland and got the houses in return. Some of the houses that were sent from the company Put Al Hoi were designed especially for Israel. One of them was the 840 model, which was sent to Solel Boneh, an Israeli construction company, and also arrived to places like the Ma'abara in Tel Yerucham, which is now the town of Yerucham. In Israel, the Finnish houses came as a temporary measure. This is why that in Israel they were not called houses. The name they used was tzrif, which in Hebrew means something like hut or cabin. And because a lot of them came from Finland, the one which came from Finland were called tzrif Finni, which means Finnish hut or Finnish cabin. This idea that these buildings were temporary was also connected to the Israeli idea that permanent housing should be built from stone or from concrete and metal. So these houses were not thought about as something that would stay in the Israeli landscape. And still the country imported thousands of them. Some of them went to hospitals. For example, in Asaf HaRofeh hospital, where they got really a complete hospital coming from Finland with all the details. Others, most of them, were sent to transition camps for the refugees. These transition camps were called Ma'abara, Ma'abarot in plural. Now, the conditions in the Ma'abara were very bad, were very tough, and usually these buildings were coming to a place which didn't have the infrastructure to maintain them or to have good living inside of them. To this added the fact that Israel was trying to get these houses on the cheap. And because of that, they tried to get the Finnish authorities and the Finnish companies to send these houses without all the details. For example, without the roof or without the floor. So the conditions in the Ma'abara, in a way, were improved because of these houses, but they were not really satisfactory. The houses in the Ma'abara didn't enjoy fine detailing like the houses in Finland, for example, like the one you can see here behind me. Instead, these houses were cramped, were crowded, they had no heating, usually no installation, and they were quite a tough place to live in. This is why, as soon as people could, they left these houses and went otherwise, to other places. And yet, for many, many Israelis to be, this was their first home in Israel. And their first memories from the country come from these houses. One example for a ma'abara which was turned into a neighborhood is Amishav in Petah Tikva in Israel. Today you have there the neighborhood Adar Ganim. Now in Amishav we can still see some of these houses which survived the fact that most of these houses were demolished. They were demolished and forgotten, but some of them stayed there. More than that, on a plaque on the synagogue there, it said that this neighborhood was called Tzrifim Finnim, Finnish houses. And the houses there are still a memory, they are still showing us the hardship that people bear when they came to Israel. And they should be conserved and they should be cherished. Not all of the houses went to the Ma'abarot. Some of the houses were sent to agricultural settlements that were built in the country after the war. There were kibbutzim, there were moshavim. Kibbutz is a commune, a moshav is a cooperative village. And there, the people who built them were also the people who lived there. They were mainly younger people. They were called chalutzim. And the way that their houses were built were very different than that of the Ma'abara. They were still very simple, but the way they were spread in the territory and so on was in another way. It was more free. It had more air around it. And for these buildings, the memory is also different, because on the one hand, they do show hardship, but on the other hand, they also show a kind of an heroic period in Israel history. An example you can see today in Kibbutz Givat Oz, where one of these houses survived. This house, which was meant for the Chaverim, for the people who were members of the kibbutz, is now being preserved and can be shown as an example for this heroic period. So with these buildings, the idea of the kibbutz as a place which came out of hardship is celebrated. Although the Finnish houses were spread all over the country, today only few of them survived. This was because most of them were demolished. The ma'abarot disappeared and the kibbutz new houses were built. Because of this, you can't see them today, but they're still there. You can see one here, another one there. And as an heritage, they are a very, very unique heritage in Israel. An example of an industrial heritage which crossed countries, a global heritage shared by Finland and Israel and the world. And for that, we should think about conserving them.
To conclude, during the decades after the Second World War, Finnish prefabricated houses served as shelters and homes for thousands of people in different circumstances. At the same time, the houses also became a tangible symbol for reconstruction. The rapid pace at which the houses could be erected also contributed to showing a progression, a hope for a better future. Returning to the theory on cultural heritage, these decades became an important part of the narrative of reconstruction of the nation and coping with the aftermaths of war in Finland, Poland and Israel. In Poland, the Finnish houses gave Polish families a possibility to create a new and modern life. In Israel, they created difference, mainly for the inhabitants of the Ma'abarats, where the camp-style life with crammed accommodations with a minimum of commodities still continued. But still, the Finnish shacks were a house of one's own.